It's the Wonkhe Show. We're talking racism in universities, the graduate premium, students with a criminal record, and financial information in a pizza graph. It's all coming up.
How do we expect people to rehabilitate themselves if they're frozen out of education? And I think back to my own time as a student when there was a chap on my course who the university found out he was a mature student, found out he had an ancient drugs conviction for possession, and he was thrown off the course. And it just wasn't clear who benefited.
Welcome to The Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into higher education, policy, people and politics. I'm Rachel Firth and here to write and sign the extension letter to higher education policy. As usual, we have three superb guests. In Buckinghamshire, we have Director of Higher Education Policy Institute, or HEPI, as it's more commonly known, Nick Hillman. Nick, give us your highlight of the week, please.
Well, good morning. I hope it still counts as this week, but last Friday we hosted a conference on value in higher education, where one of our keynote speakers was Jim Dickinson, who you know very well.
Are you saying Jim was your highlight of the week? I think that's
well,
that's
we got
all
I'll say is we got very good feedback on Jim's session.
And in Bermondsey, we have Chief Programmes Officer at the brilliant club, Richard Eyre. Richard, give us your highlight of the week, please.
Good morning, Rachel. My highlight of the week was accompanying nearly 100 14-year-olds from state schools on a trip to St Catherine's College, Oxford, yesterday as part of one of our programmes, and essentially just seeing how excited they were to be learning about university and how proud their teachers were of them.
Finally, in Wonkhe HQ, we have Wonkhe's editor, Debbie McVitty. Debbie, give us your highlight of the week, please.
Good morning. Well, as you know, Rachel, our week has been very full of Wonkfest preparation, and we're getting sort of more frantic and more excited by the day. So I'm going to say the highlight of the week is the whole week, because we're just super excited for Wonkfest.
This week, we start with the release of the Equality and Human Rights Commission report on racism at university. The report, Tackling Racial Harassment, University's Challenge, suggests universities are unaware of the scale of racial harassment on campus and overconfident in their ability to handle it. Debbie, can you give us an overview of this one, please?
Right, yes. So the first thing to say, this is a big report. It's a serious report. They've done research. They've had roundtables with senior people in universities, and they've obviously worked very closely with the higher education sector, especially Universities UK, who's tasked with doing a lot of taking the recommendations forward. What the report finds is they've done some effort to try and understand the scale of the problem of racial harassment in universities, but one of the things that I think is quite clear coming through is that instances of racial harassment are highly likely to be underreported. That's partly because the people who might be targeted, who might experience these sorts of incidents, have quite low confidence in university complaints procedures. And the consequence of that is that many universities, particularly those who have fewer ethnic minority staff and students, tend to be a bit more complacent, perhaps, or sanguine about the kind of scale of the issues that are going on inside their universities. And I think this report will be something of a wake-up call to all universities, but particularly to those. But where I think the report gets interesting, and where I think the debate has really circled around, is this question about how do you understand racial harassment, incidents of racial harassment and behaviours of racial harassment as part of a wider kind of cultural problem of structural racism. And I think what the report does quite well, I think, is it talks about how microaggression works, about the kind of the small but important ways in which ethnic minorities are excluded, are the victims of kind of jokes or banter or kind of small aggressions that are kind of hard to pinpoint. And I think any it's sort of, and the consequence of that sort of thing is that often people who are in positions of power, in this instance white people, don't really see it and tend to doubt people's account of when it's happened. And you get that sort of gaslighting effect as, are you sure that they really meant it? Are you sure you weren't imagining it? And the kind of consequence, and this is the sort of structural and cultural racism that builds up, that has a really, really awful impact on people just sort of trying to make their way in higher education, and I think gives a very sort of disproportionate burden of kind of dealing with the consequences of structural racism. Now, this really is where the kind of critique of the report has come in, and one of the kind of things that people are saying, I think legitimately, is that the report hasn't really engaged closely enough with some of the kind of the things that black academics and black students are talking about in some of those wider debates about things like decolonising the curriculum, about the way kind of higher education systems are sort of built on the kind of history of racism and are sort of structurally racist. And people are particularly unhappy about references to instances of racial harassment that are between English and Welsh and Scottish people. So sort of saying that this is very much not the issue that we're talking about here, because that's an issue of, the power imbalance is very different here. And you really can't make these two things the same.
I'm always a little bit nervous about talking about issues of racism in the sector when, as a white middle-aged man, I've obviously not been on the receiving end of it, but it is a wake-up call. It's very salutary. I mean, sometimes we like to think of universities as being really open, really tolerant, really diverse places. And this report reminds us that actually they reflect some of the problems in society as well as some of the good things in society. A couple of thoughts came to mind as I was reading it. One was there's probably a much more developed debate in schooling than there is in higher education about how diversity leads to better learning. Actually the learning of all students can be better if the lecture halls are truly diverse. And secondly, I think one warning point is when a university really grips an issue like this, and it goes for other issues too, you often see a spike in their numbers because they make it easier to report improper, bad behaviour. And when it's easier to report things, the numbers go up. And I think we need to be careful of not attacking universities that make it easier to report these things, because that is the start of the solution. And you see
it with sexual harassment as well recently, haven't we? The numbers have shot up, and of course that's probably not because there's more of it going on.
The experience and the perception of the experience and worrying about the experience is something that really affects students' experience at university. But it's also one of the things that plays into one of the challenges around access, which is people feeling, will I belong? And I think I think that the thing that came out from this report to me were two strands, and at the same time the importance of seeing how they're interconnected, but also not completely conflating the two with each other. One of which is about whether you've got truly diverse, inclusive higher education institutions, which we don't for the most part at the moment, and making sure that people feel like they belong there. But another important part of that was making sure that when, as you say, you've got either really overt discrimination or equally important microaggressions, that those things are dealt with and seem to be dealt with. Because I think when they're not, that is the sort of thing that creates a climate of students or potential students thinking this isn't somewhere that I'd feel at home or that I'd feel safe.
Yeah, I think this point, and I think it's completely right. We should, when we talk about things, we should check our privilege, and we should say, yeah, we haven't had direct experience of this, and as a consequence, we're speaking from a particular standpoint. And I don't think that you guys were saying this at all, but one of the things that came through really strongly was this kind of nervousness about people just talking about race, and I think there's something here about if people are listening to this and thinking, yeah, okay, but what can I do? We're in this very, you might be working in a very white institution, for example. There are so many great books and websites and people writing in this space who, Black academics, Black students who have really interesting things to say. And I think, if one thing comes of this, if as white people we'll go off and kind of read these books and engage with these kind of criticisms of the HE culture, then we will find it easier. We will find it easier to talk about race. We will be coming from a more informed perspective, and we'll be able to kind of, I guess, begin to get past this sort of discomfort that is fundamentally silencing the victims of racial harassment and racism.
Because we work in the higher education sector, I don't think we should ever be scared of reading stuff. So I sort of agree with what Debbie said. And one book that has really challenged me, and it probably challenged me more than anything else I've read about higher education, is Kalwant Bhopal's book, White Privilege. She's at Birmingham University. And, as I say, as a white middle-aged man, it's quite unsettling reading that book. And sorry to plug something that HEPI itself has produced, but we recently produced The White Elephant in the Room, which also has a chapter actually by Kalwant in it. But it has some other very interesting chapters about, including one from London South Bank, about the really difficult conversations you need to have on campus to get to the bottom of these issues, and really challenging people's long-held perceptions about the world, which may sometimes turn out just to be wrong.
Now, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hello there, it's James Darunian. I'm a National Teaching Fellow and I work at the University of Gloucestershire, mainly on social sciences. So the piece which I've published is looking at National Teaching Fellows, and it's basically arguing that Teaching Excellence Framework, that's the TEF, says that teaching is valued as much as research. And in the old days, right at the beginning of the National Teaching Fellowship Scheme, the HEA, as was, used to give £10,000 and more to successful National Teaching Fellows. And National Teaching Fellows are those that are judged to be excellent in terms of teaching by their peers, by other academics. We should be properly financially valuing the excellent teachers that we say, as institutions, we value.
And don't forget, we would love to have your contribution on the site. If you'd like to pitch us a piece, just drop us an email on team@wonkhe.com with your idea and we will be in touch. Next up, is the graduate premium decreasing? Research from HESA and the Department for Economics at the University of Warwick suggests that the financial return on a degree at age 26 fell 8 percentage points in a 20-year period. So, Richard, what is going on here then?
Thanks, Rachel. This research shows that if you're a typical graduate born in 1970, then by the time you reach 26, so in 1996, you were earning 19% more than 26-year-olds without a degree. But if you were born in 1990, then by the time you were 26, so in 2016, that graduate premium had fallen to only 11%. And that seems to confirm the received wisdom that we often hear that degrees are worth less than they were in the past. But there's a few reasons, I think, not to purely take this at face value. So first, as the report itself points out, we're only talking about the difference in earnings at age 26. The report says nothing about how earnings grow throughout someone's career, and we know from research that they may continue to grow past that age. Second, in some senses, it's not that surprising that if graduates make up a bigger chunk of the population, their average relative earnings are going to be closer to the overall average. Okay, so again, the report says nothing about the impact of studying a different subject or studying at a different institution on graduate earnings. And third, this is the bit that most often gets lost, third, the value of higher education isn't just about future earnings, so it's important for us to bear that in mind. So overall, this report is a helpful reminder to me that analyses like this they're important from an economic perspective. They're important from that sense. They're really limited for thinking about how individuals make decisions, and in some ways, some of the wider reporting about this, not on Wonkhe, of course, but some of the wider reporting reminds me sometimes of the way that health research is reported. I mean, it's a contribution to the stock of knowledge about what we know about the value of a degree, but the takeaways for individuals are not that clear.
It's a very interesting report using some interesting data sets that haven't been mined as deeply as they might have been before. So while I agree with everything Richard said, I think we mustn't lose sight of the big picture. So the results, even where they're lower, are still very positive. So even for the younger people, the graduate premium is still very significant, is the first thing to say. And of course, many of them became adults, during austerity effectively. So it's pretty good that they're still doing very well in the labour market. And the second thing, of course, is that going to higher education is not just about the graduate premium. There are so many other benefits from all sorts of education, particularly higher education, in terms of well-being and health and civic participation, that it's important to know the universities are delivering the skills that employers want. But it's also important to know the universities are delivering all the other things that mean you have a fulfilling life.
I think it's a useful contribution. I think the problem is that our framing of this sorts of evidence is always about the returns to a degree. So it always gets focused in on the value of a degree. And I'm actually not going to make the case that a degree is worth more than money, because I think that's been ably made. But I think basically this idea that if you just make it about the return to higher education, you basically let the wider economy off the hook. And I think just raising skill levels in the economy, which is what higher education does, is basically says we're going to have more people with higher level skills. It just doesn't automatically raise productivity or indeed grow the economy. You need employers who know how to use graduate skills so that we don't have the problem of graduate underemployment. You need support for entrepreneurialism. You need infrastructure investment. You need kind of R&D investment, and you need a kind of an economy that is thriving so that those graduates can then go in and kind of be part of that and drive it and take it forward. So sort of, I guess, blaming higher education for and we must remember as well this, the graduates born in 1990 were kind of coming of age at the exact moment that the world economy was going into freefall. So there's big bigger kind of context here that this needs to be situated in, and I think the report's authors kind of do acknowledge that. And assuming we're not going to stop people kind of pursuing higher education or the skills that they want and being kind of the best person that they can be, the question I think is about how do we create the economic conditions and make kind of growth of graduate level skills part of that, so that we can kind of get the economic growth that's going to contribute to everyone's well-being.
Yeah, I think those are exactly the points to make. So, as Nick said, really, really interesting methodology. The authors of the report looked at the British cohort study and the next steps data set, and then they cross-checked them against the labour force survey, so that they were able to understand as much as they could about the people that they were looking at, the graduates and non-graduates that they were looking at, and within the headline decline from 19% graduate premium to 11% graduate premium, they actually said it doesn't happen in a smooth line. So actually, there's a little bit of a decline from the beginning of the 80s into the mid 80s, but then it really drops off for people born after 1987. And when were those people born in 1987 graduating? As Debbie says, they were graduating, most of them in 2008. So they're going straight into the crash. It is David Kernahan in his blog on Wonkhe, I think, puts this really well, and in that it's easy to spin crude narratives, easy narratives about too many people going to university, degrees being missold. That's a really easy narrative to spin. A much harder thing, as Debbie says, to engage with is what does the economy need to be like in order to reduce graduate underemployment and make sure that we actually get the levels of productivity out of our now what is going to be about 50% graduate workforce, and that's much harder. Like that's a question. It's a bit like climate change. It's in some ways it's much easier to attack it, but really the question is, we have a massive productivity crisis in the UK. What are we going to do about that?
And I guess if there was anyone who wasn't as invested in higher education as the four of us may be, they may argue that if it was decreasing the graduate premium, we wouldn't be the first people to admit that, and we may find lots of reasons to defend that and other kind of external factors why that might not be the case. So I guess the point I'm bringing to the three of you is, if this was a problem and it was indeed on the decrease, would we ever kind of acknowledge that as a sector and address it? Or do you really think the factors, the mitigating factors are, they're enough to mitigate all of this? Nick, let me bring you in.
Well, I think that's a fair challenge. And of course, we should listen to other voices. But let's not forget that even the lower numbers in this report are very positive. So even the people who do less well, the cohort that does less well, are doing well. And so a purebred economist might say they're actually too positive. It actually suggests the fact that employers are paying, even in the depth of austerity, graduates much more than non-graduates, suggests there still aren't enough graduates. So, I think the argument could be used both ways. And, as I said, a pure economist would say, so long as the return is positive at all, even if it was only 1% positive, that would still suggest employers are willing to pay employers more. So I think the argument could be run either way.
Yeah, no, indeed. Final word, Richard.
Yeah, I'll bring this back to my point about how useful is it for people, for students, for parents, for people advising young people who are making a decision. Okay, and what it comes down to is this. As Nick says, the graduate premium is still significant. And for people who've got the social capital, who've got the knowledge, they know that if you get a degree in the right subject from the right university, the graduate premium is much, much higher than 11%. Now, people, to the point that you made, Rachel, people can say, well, wouldn't we say that? Wouldn't we be talking about the higher education sector? I think it's entirely possible that there are other ways for us to have a really high-skilled, high-paid workforce that don't involve more people going to university. But I think we'd need to see what they are. And at the moment, what we have is a growth in low-skill, low-wage jobs in our economy as a whole, and that crisis of productivity is what we really need to address. And saying too many people going to university is, as Nick says, is the evidence isn't really there for it, but also it's not an answer to the problem.
Every week we are delving deep into the sector's past to uncover stories of how things were and how things came to be. With Nottingham Trent's academic registrar Mike Ratcliffe, here is the hidden history of HE.
The way we organise our curriculum, the way that it's structured into a bachelor's degree and a master's degree and a doctoral degree is a kind of inheritance of the medieval curriculum structure, which in turn is an inheritor of the kind of late antiquity notion of what made a good education for a citizen. The idea was that you would separate the curriculum that you would teach to people so that they had a general education, and then you would go on and develop it. And the way the medieval university worked is that once you attained the master's rank at the university, you could teach anywhere in Christendom. You could take your degree and teach absolutely anywhere. And so the ability to take your master's degree was seen as the most important thing. And the curriculum was split so that the first 3 or so years you did a foundational course, and then in your last 3 years at university you would spend your time much more in debate and discussion, and you would advance your study and be therefore in a position to become a teacher. You'd be in a position to do that. And so the first chunk of the time you got a bachelor's degree. You admitted to a bachelor's degree, and the second part you admitted to a master's degree. All in arts, because that was all the thing was. It was all general. There was no specialisation. You took the course. And this pattern gets to be the stabilising organisational factor of both English and Scottish universities. You take the course and then you leave it. But the second part of the course starts to become much less interesting when Oxford and Cambridge become more of a place for gentlemen to go. They don't really want to learn how to be able to teach, and therefore the master's bit slowly wanes, and therefore the ability to come and take the exercises that you need to do slowly falls out of favour. But they allow the fact that if you're in good standing, you can still get the degree of master. And so slowly over time the requirements fall away, and you end up in the situation that you do the first part of your study, you get your bachelor's degree, and then as long as you don't muck up and you're in good standing, you can top that up with your master's degree at the end. So we have a situation which confuses some people, especially people writing Wikipedia entries for politicians, that people think that they've studied an MA, but actually of course they haven't. They've just done what the rest of us have done, a bachelor's degree, and then a certain number of terms afterwards, depending on the arcane rules of the different universities, you can upgrade that to a master's. So you end up with this slightly strange situation that sits in place. At the start of the 19th century, when the university think it's probably a good idea to introduce rigorous examinations, there is an attempt to bring in proper structures for people to get their MAs. But because people have got into the habit of just turning up and graduating, it doesn't stick, and therefore all the effort is put in terms of organising the honours level and not worrying too much about the fact that people could come back and take their MA, and it becomes atrophied into a rank. But Durham and London, when they set up their universities, they decide they will have exams for the master's degree, and therefore they become an extra exercise that you can come and do at the end. You go away with your first degree, but if you want to come back and do more study, it is proper study. You actually have to do something to get your master's degree. A little later, Harvard drops. Harvard had gone into the same kind of wheeze. It had inherited this. It decides that that's no good as well. So it also institutes the idea that you actually have to do learning and take exams to get your MA. You can't just apply for it. So we've continued with this kind of strange setup. It survived the qualifications framework, Oxford and Cambridge, except that it's not a degree, it's a rank inside the university, and generally everyone is happy with this. But just as an example of how sometimes we need to look to our lawmakers for a thorough discussion on these things, in 2011, Chris Leslie, MP for a part of Nottingham, brought a private member's bill called Master's Degrees Minimum Standards Bill. And the idea obviously being that he's going to kill off the MAs at Oxford and Cambridge. So it's one of those private members' days, so there's the obligatory backbench Tory MPs trying to talk everything out. So David Nuttall is on filibustering duty that day. They've already talked out something about equality, so they have another go at talking this one out. But Chris sets off to say the time has come to end this anachronism, and a growing body of opinion believes it's time to draw a veil over these arrangements. If we set aside the cheeky sense of privilege, even the most battle-hardened defenders of elitism have to admit that the total and utter lack of merit behind this apparently great award is unfair. Surely it is now in the best interest of modern and open Oxford and Cambridge universities for them voluntarily to relinquish this privilege and prove they are beacons of genuine learning and earned distinction. And it's David Willits who gets the reply, the holder of an Oxford MA, of course, and declares that interest, of course. I did shell out eventually to buy my MA, he says, on the record, in order to vote in the elections for the Chancellor of the University of Oxford and for the Professor of Poetry. As an MA, you have a status that allows you to vote in some of those things. For us to act, we would not only have to be persuaded of the problem of confusion, he says, but would have to take a significant step towards intervening in the internal arrangements of the universities in question. That's where the position of the Shadow Minister rather surprises me, because my view, David Willits, is that intervening in such a way in the autonomous decisions of the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge would go contrary to what I thought was the shared view of both front benches, the view that the autonomy of our universities was one of their reasons for success. And he concludes by saying, Leslie has enabled me to set up my beliefs in a Tory in protecting those institutions and traditions where they do not do anyone any damage. So, there we have the philosophy of the Minister of State for Universities and Science. And obviously Oxford and Cambridge continue happily awarding MAs to people, and it's a tradition. And as I said, apart from some people are confused on Wikipedia, it does no one any harm.
Next up, prison education and admission reform for convicted applicants. 10 universities have signed up to a pledge promoted by UPP Foundation and Unlock, which sees institutions make a commitment to offering a fair chance to students with a criminal record. Nick, could you give us an overview of this, please?
Yeah, so as you say, this is an initiative by 10 universities, so only a very small proportion of all universities, but it is, I think, very important. So they're pledging to do specific actions, or in some cases not to do specific actions. So, for example, they won't ask applicants about their criminal records unless it's absolutely necessary. I think it's a really interesting initiative, because how do we expect people to rehabilitate themselves if they're frozen out of education? And I think back to my own time as a student when there was a chap on my course who the university found out he was a mature student, found out an ancient drugs conviction for possession, and he was thrown off the course. And it just wasn't clear who benefited from that decision. So I think this is really important, and I hope it's rolled out to more than 10 universities in due course. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all, because what about people rehabilitating themselves, starting their rehabilitation while they're still in prison, which leads me neatly onto a report that HEPI has just published about how we think, it's done with the Open University, how we think prisoners should be able to access higher education earlier than they can now. Currently, you can only get a loan for higher education if you're within 6 years of release. So some of the most prisoners with the most serious convictions just can't access higher education. And sometimes until it's too late, they've often lost interest by the time they're 6 years within release. And we know that prisoners and ex-prisoners who access education have lower conviction rates. So there's also a huge saving, both financially, but also to society, if people with criminal convictions are able to better themselves, frankly. Prison, I know it gets to the heart of the debate about whether prison should be a punishment or an experience with some opportunities. And, why can't it be both?
Yeah, I mean, I pick up on Nick's last point, because I think there is still this kind of sense in wider society that people who are in prison, it's because they're fundamentally bad people and they need to be kept away from the rest of us, and they need to really, really suffer the consequences of what they've done, and not to downplay some of the kind of terrible things that people have done that has caused them to be put in prison. But also we know, for example, that prisoners have an enormously disproportionate struggles with mental health specific issues, and we know that lots of people are presumably in there for things that they kind of did very early in their lives, and at times when they were perhaps vulnerable, or there may be sort of mitigating things to be aware of, and so this is my sort of bleeding heart liberal perspective. Absolutely as much education as you can possibly give. And I remember being absolutely horrified when a kind of a justice minister said that they're going to deprive prisoners of books. And I think actually Michael Gove kind of brought it back and said, no, of course we're not going to do that, and brought books back into prisons. But, I do think there's something really important here about kind of saying, these are people, people have done bad things, but we needn't think of them as bad people. And the more we can kind of do at the policy level, and, that, as Nick pointed out, it's good for all of us to give people a pathway back into kind of productive contributing society, then, let's do that. But I realise that that's perhaps not, that's a little bit against the grain of what sort of society in general seems to think, or perhaps what politicians think society in general thinks.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a really interesting example of this. I think links back to what we were saying earlier about the wider value of a degree. So you could say that if somebody is in prison, that what you really want is to focus on maybe level 2 qualifications, technical qualifications, things that are going to get them immediately into a job on release. But actually, as Nick was saying, this is about engaging interest. And for some people, it might be that getting them to think differently about themselves and what they can achieve and essentially what their life is for, that having the opportunity to study biochemistry or to study, early modern history or whatever it is, actually engages them and gets them thinking differently about their life, that could be much, much more powerful in helping them rehabilitate and helping them play a valuable role in society, and not cost society a huge amount of money, which we always got to remember that with sentencing policies. It costs us an enormous amount of money to incarcerate somebody, and that's just the cost of the state aside to the cost of the individual and their family. It does occur to me actually that there's, and I'd be interested in what you thought about this, Nick, that there's maybe like a sort of a tip of the iceberg here when it comes to things like saying, like asking about convictions, that, some people might be excluded because of their conviction, but there's probably actually a lot of people who just don't apply because they don't want to get into talking about the fact that they have a conviction from a fray from when they were 19. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that is probably true. And I think the media needs to be responsible here as well, because we've been working with the Open University on this document, and they deliver more education to prisoners than any other university. And I know that they are very conscious that sometimes when the media talk about really serious criminals having access to education, it's sometimes, it's as if they're living the life of Riley in prisons. But so we need to be sensitive about how we talk about this. And one of the things I learned during this process, which is really interesting to me at least, is that it's very hard to deliver education to prisoners because prisoners move prisons very often. So a university that wants to develop a close relationship with the prisoners in their local prison can find that very hard, because 6 months into a course, the prisoner might then be moved to a different prison elsewhere in the country. And that can make the practicalities of delivering education very challenging. And I think the prisons minister needs to think about that. And it's why, of course, the Open University is often the best answer. The other reason why I think this is such an interesting area, and I think Debbie and Richard put their finger on it when they were talking about the dispute between Chris Grayling and Michael Gove. Both of those people are quite right-wing. They're probably on the right wing of the Conservative Party, and they take a very different attitude towards this issue. So for me, the whole rehabilitation, punishment, how many people should be in prison debate doesn't seem to be a left-wing, right-wing debate. It seems to be a debate that transcends those traditional political differences. And I think that is because it is such a complex and interesting area.
Now it's time for Yes, but does it correlate? Here to set this week's correlation question is Wonkhe's associate editor, David Kernaghan.
Welcome to Yes, but does it correlate? The podcast segment that writes 2 letters every week, X and Y. I whiled away a happy hour this week playing with the new Universities UK guidance on presenting institutional financial information to students. There's a number of categories in each pizza graph, and New UK specifies the contents of each category quite carefully. I've plotted the government research income category against the teaching and research expenditure category. But is there a correlation?
I think, what is it, P? P is probably 0.53, something like that,
I think it's R, isn't it?
Oh, R then. R squared.
Yeah.
This is why we keep TK around.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not the person to go to for the data stuff.
I'm not going to give you a figure, but I would say yes, I think it does correlate, and probably even more highly than Debbie said.
I'm going to be boring and say I also would say there's probably a medium to strong positive correlation.
Yes, there is. A surprisingly robust R-squared of 0.94, although this dips to a less startling 0.54 if you remove the Russell Group. Government research income covers QR and related funding, alongside research council income, central government, local authorities, health authorities, and tax credits. Teaching and research expenditure includes academic staff costs and other related expenditure. I've added the total income as the size of the marker. Data is taken from the HESA finance record and is UK-wide, and where the data does not exist, I've not plotted it.
And finally, Universities UK has published a new guide on producing university financial information for students. The guide notes that the majority of students in all nations of the UK believe their university does not publish sufficient accessible information on university income and expenditure, especially on how tuition fees are spent. Debbie, I'm assuming you've seen this guide. What did you make of this?
I have indeed. We remember, so this guide comes against the backdrop of the Office for Students' launch of the Value for Money strategy on Friday, which includes kind of the point made quite strongly that publishing information to students about university finances is part of understanding the kind of picture of value for money, because students need to understand where their fees are going, and they need to understand kind of what all the things universities are investing in that kind of generate the value that they might make a judgment about. So Universities UK basically says, well, you can, if you show students, it would be easier if I had visuals, but I don't. So if you imagine a kind of a circle of, a proportion of income of coming from different sources, so some from the government, some from students, some from endowment, and so on, and then you might show a similar circle showing where all the expenditure goes. So we say, well, some of it gets spent on learning and teaching, and some of it gets spent on facilities, and some of it gets spent on the Vice Chancellor's car, and whatever you want to put in there. Although I don't think the Vice Chancellor's car actually features as a HESA financial category. And then Universities UK says, well, and then what you might want to do is, you might want to kind of set the scene a little bit for, understand the kind of wider kind of sector context and the financial risks that are on institutions' balance sheets, and you might want to talk about things like ethical investment strategies and where you're kind of divesting from kind of less ethical investments, and you might also want to explain things like, oh well, when we do invest a proportion of student fees in access and outreach, so some of your fees goes to help less advantaged students, and kind of try and explain that whole picture. And I think this is where it gets a bit, questionable. I think the kind of the motivation is there, and trying to present this information in a kind of nuanced way is really sensible. But I sort of left feeling that this would be fantastic for a lay governor or a journalist or someone in the community who's trying to understand university finances. I'm not sure it's going to kind of really address the needs of students, but maybe my fellow panelists will disagree.
Richard, agree or disagree? It doesn't have to be that arbitrary.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This, funnily enough, this puts me in mind of a conversation I had when I was a student union representative about a suggestion at my institution that we should be itemising in the bills that were sent out to students all of the other money that was subsidising the education and experience that students were receiving. This was a very different time in terms of higher education funding, and asked whether I thought that was a good idea because it would make it a bit more transparent. And my answer at the time was no, I think it would just annoy people. It would just annoy students to essentially be told that they were getting a great deal, because really people have a sense of whether they're getting a good deal or not. The thing that the reason we struggle to see that in the current funding system is that the complexity of our fee loan repayment system makes it really hard to see what you'd see in a normal functioning market, which is if people think they're getting poor value for money, they go somewhere else. That we don't have the same sort of price signals operating. So as Debbie says, like, more transparency is good for people who are interested in taking a view on value for money. Having the data out there and having it presented in a user-friendly way has got to be a positive thing. But if the desire is for students to suddenly, have a very strong appreciation of the value for money that they're getting at a different institution, I don't think it's going to do that.
Well, I'm a lot more positive actually about the initiative for a number of reasons. One is every year in our big survey of students, 3/4 tell us they want much more information about where their fees go, and I think that number's already been referred to. Secondly, we've been pushing the government on this for a long time, and what UK have done is so much better. They published a report 6 years ago called Where Student Fees Go. You can look it up online. It's still online. And it didn't answer the question, at all. And so although their new publication doesn't go as far as some people, including I think Jim Wonkhe, wants, it goes so much further than anybody's gone before and has some really good case studies at the back. And I agree with Richard and Debbie that not 100% of students are going to engage with this information. But you don't need 100% of students to engage with it for it to stimulate really interesting conversations on campus and in governing body meetings and in meetings between the Students' Union and the university. You just need some really engaged students, staff and governors to be over this information, to have some interesting conversations. And I think it helps because I think, when we had the strikes last year, some students divided their fees by the number of hours they'd missed out and worked out a sort of per lecture number and asked to have that money back from the university. But they were forgetting about all the other things their fees pay for. And when you tell students where their fees go, it reminds them that counselling costs money, the library costs money, the Students' Union and other social spaces cost money, the sports facilities cost money. And then you can have a sensible conversation as to whether the money is being divvied up sensibly or not.
So that is about it for this week. To find out more about anything we've discussed today, you'll find links on the episode page at wonkhe.com, where you can also leave your thoughts in comments. And don't forget, you can subscribe to us automatically. Just search for The Wonkhe Show on your favourite podcast directory, or you can find the feed that you need on wonkhe.com/podcast. So massive thanks again to our guests Nick, Richard and Debbie, to everyone at Team Wonkhe for making the show happen, and of course you to listening to the very end. And until next week, stay wonky.